Today we got some more actual history about a very interesting pioneer of Western Virginia named Louis Wetzel. We'll be reading from this book, History of the Early Settlements and Indian Wars of West Virginia, by Wills de Haas. This book was published all the way back in 1851. Louis Wetzel was a frontiersman, scout, and Indian fighter who was born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in 1763. In 1770, his family moved into a frontier settlement near Wheeling Creek in West Virginia. Wetzel's family and the other families in that settlement were the frequent subjects of Indian attacks, and one of these attacks led Louis Wetzel to swear a vow of vengeance on all Indians. As you'll see, his story is similar to that of Jeff Turner, who swore a similar vow of vengeance after his family was killed by Indians in Texas, or Cochise, who led a war of extermination against all white settlers in Arizona after Lieutenant George Bascom killed some of his family members. Here is the story of Louis Wetzel. Who in the West has not heard of Wetzel, the daring borderer, the brave and successful Indian hunter, the Daniel Boone of northwestern Virginia? Within the recollection of many of our readers, Louis Wetzel was regarded by many of the settlers in the neighborhood of Wheeling as the right arm of their defense. His presence was considered as a tower of strength to the infant settlements, and an object of terror to the fierce and restless Indians who prowled about and depredated upon our frontier homes. The memory of Wetzel should be embalmed in the hearts of the people of Western Virginia, for his efforts in defense of their forefathers were without a parallel in border warfare. Among the foremost and most devoted, he plunged into the fearful strife which a bloody and relentless foe waged against the feeble colonists. He threw into the common treasury a soul as heroic, as adventurous, as full of energy, and exhaustless of resources as ever animated the human breast. Bold, wary, and active, he stood without an equal in the pursuit to which he had committed himself, mind and body. No man on the western frontier was more dreaded by the enemy, and none did more to beat him back into the heart of the forest, and reclaim the expanseless domain which we now enjoy. Unfortunately for the memory of Wetzel, no reliable account of him has ever been published. The present generation know little of his personal history, save as gathered from the exaggerated pages of romance, or scarcely less painted traditions of the day. With many he is regarded as having been very little better than a semi-savage, a man whose disposition was that of the enraged tiger, and whose only propensity was for blood. Our information warrants us in stating that these conceptions are all false. Louis Wetzel was never known to inflict unwanted cruelty upon women and children, as has been charged upon him, and he never was found to torture or mutilate his victim, as many of the traditions would indicate. He was revengeful because he had suffered deep injury at the hands of that race, and woe to the Indian warrior who crossed his path. Louis Wetzel was literally a man without fear. He was brave as a lion, cunning as a fox, daring where daring was the wiser part, prudent when discretion was valor's better self. He seemed to possess in a remarkable degree that intuitive knowledge which can alone constitute a good and efficient hunter, added to which he was sagacious, prompt to act, and always aiming to render his actions efficient. Such was Louis Wetzel, the celebrated Indian hunter of Western Virginia. John Wetzel, the father of Louis, was one of the first settlers on Wheeling Creek. He had 5 sons and 2 daughters whose names were respectively Martin, Louis, Jacob, John, George, Susan, and Christina. The elder Wetzel spent much of his time in locating lands, hunting, and fishing. His neighbors frequently admonished him against exposing himself thus to the enemy, but disregarding their advice and laughing at their fears, he continued to widen the range of his excursions until finally he fell a victim to the active vigilance of the tawny foe. He was killed near Captina in 1787, on his return from Middle Island Creek under the following circumstances. Himself and companion were in a canoe, paddling slowly near the shore, when they were hailed by a party of Indians and ordered to land. This they of course refused when immediately they were fired upon and Wetzel shot through the body. Feeling himself mortally wounded, he directed his companion to lie down in the canoe, while he, Wetzel, so long as strength remained, would paddle the frail vessel beyond the reach of the Indians. In this way, he saved the life of his friend while his own was ebbing fast. He died soon after reaching the shore at Baker's Station, and his humble grave can still be seen near the site of that primitive fortress. At the time of his father's death, Lewis was about 23 years of age, and in common with his brothers or those who were old enough, swore sleepless vengeance against the whole Indian race. Terribly did he and they carry that resolution into effect. From that time forward they were devoted to the wood, and an Indian, whether in peace or war, at night or by day, was a doomed man in the presence of either. The name of Wetzel sent a thrill of horror through the heart of the stoutest Indian, before whom a more terrible image could not be conjured up than one of these relentless long knives. The first event of record in the life of Lewis Wetzel occurred when he was about 14 years of age. The Indians had not been very troublesome in the immediate vicinity of his father's house, and no great apprehensions were felt, as it was during a season of comparative quietude. On the occasion referred to, Lewis had just stepped from his father's door, and was looking at his brother Jacob playing, when suddenly turning toward the corn crib, he saw a gun pointing around the corner. Quick as thought, he jumped back, but not in time to escape the ball. It took effect upon the breastbone, carrying away a small portion, and cutting a fearful wound across his chest. In an instant, two athletic warriors sprang from behind the crib, and quietly making prisoners of the lads, bore them off without being discovered. On the second day they reached the Ohio, and crossing near the mouth of McMahon's Creek gained the Big Lick, about 20 miles from the river. During the whole of this painful march, Lewis suffered severely from his wound, but bore up with true courage, knowing if he complained, the tomahawk would be his doom. That night, on lying down, the Indians, contrary to their custom, failed to tie their prisoners. Lewis now resolved to escape, and in the course of an hour or two, satisfying himself that the Indians were asleep, touched Jacob, and both arose without disturbing their captors. Lewis, leading the way, pushed into the woods. Finding, however, that he could not travel without moccasins, he returned to camp, and soon came back with 2 pair, which, having fitted on, Lewis said, "Now I must go back for father's gun," which the Indians had taken earlier. Securing this, the 2 boys started in the direction of home. Finding the path, they traveled on briskly for some time, but hearing a noise, listened and ascertained that the Indians were in pursuit. The lads stepped aside as the pursuers came up, and then again moved on. Soon they heard the Indians return, and by the same plan effectually eluded them. Before daylight they were again followed by 2 on horseback, but resorting to a similar expedient readily escaped detection. On the following day, at about 11 o'clock, the 2 boys reached the Ohio River, at a point opposite of Zane's Island. Lashing together 2 logs, they crossed over, and were once more with their friends. Reaching the years of manhood, Lewis Wetzel spent most of his time in the woods. He was truly a genuine child of the forest, and seemed to worship the grand old trees with more than pagan devotion. To him the wilderness was full of charms, but the enjoyment of these was not without great personal danger. A dark, insidious foe prowled upon his track, and closely watched every opportunity to waylay and destroy him. Wetzel roamed abroad, delighted with every fresh grove, hill, dale, and rippling stream. To him the swelling of the breeze, the repose of the leaf, the mysterious quiet of the shade, the chant of birds, the whoop of the savage, and the long melancholy howl of the wolf were sights and sounds which stirred his most lively sensibilities. Rising from his couch of leaves by the side of some moss-covered log, the lone hunter made his hurried meal, and then moved on, careless of fatigue, until night again closed around him. Such was the woodman's life, such the fascinations which bound him to the wilderness. Shortly after Crawford's defeat, a man named Thomas Mills, in escaping from that unfortunate expedition, reached the Indian Spring about 9 miles from Wheeling, on the present National Road, where he was compelled to leave his horse and proceed to Wheeling on foot. Thence he went to Van Meter's fort, and after a day or two's rest induced Lewis Wetzel to go with him to the spring for his horse. Lewis cautioned him against the danger, but Mills was determined, and the 2 started. Approaching the spring, they discovered the horse tied to a tree, and Wetzel at once comprehended their danger. Mills walked up to unfasten the animal, when instantly a discharge of rifles followed, and the unfortunate man fell mortally wounded. Wetzel now turned, and knowing his only escape was in flight, plunged through the enemy and bounded off at the very extent of his speed. 4 fleet Indians followed in rapid pursuit, whooping in proud exultation of soon overhauling their intended victim. After a chase of half a mile, one of the most active Indians approached so close that Wetzel was afraid that he might throw his tomahawk, and instantly wheeling, shot the fellow dead in his tracks. In early youth, Lewis had acquired the habit of loading his gun while at a full run, and now he felt the great advantage of it. Keeping in advance of his pursuers during another half mile, a second Indian came up, and turning to fire, the Indian caught the end of his gun, and for a time the contest was doubtful. At one moment the Indian, by his great strength and dexterity, brought Wetzel to his knee, and had nearly wrenched the rifle from the hands of his antagonist, when Lewis, by a renewed effort, drew the weapon from the grasp of the Indian, and thrusting the muzzle against the side of his neck, pulled the trigger, killing him instantly. The other 2 Indians by this time had nearly overtaken him, but leaping forward he kept ahead, until his unerring rifle was a third time loaded. Anxious to have done with that kind of sport, he slackened his pace, and even stopped once or twice to give the pursuers an opportunity to face him. Every time, however, that he looked round, the Indians treed, unwilling any longer to encounter his destructive weapon. After running a mile or 2 further in this manner, he reached an open piece of ground, and wheeling suddenly, the foremost Indian jumped behind a tree, but which not screening his body, Wetzel fired and dangerously wounded him. The remaining Indian made an immediate retreat, yelling as he went, "No catch dat man! Him gun always loaded!" In the summer of 1786, the Indians having become troublesome in the neighborhood of Wheeling, particularly at the Short Creek settlement, and a party having killed a man near Mingo Bottom, it was determined to send an expedition after the retreating enemy of sufficient force to chastise them most effectually. $100 were offered to the man who should bring in the first Indian scalp. Major McMahon, living at Beach Bottom, headed the expedition, and Lewis Wetzel was one of his men. They crossed the river on the 5th of August, and proceeded by a rapid march to the Muskingum. The expedition numbered about 20 men, and in advance of 5 were detailed to reconnoiter. This party reported to the commander that they had discovered the camp of the enemy, but that it was far too numerous to think of making an attack. A consultation was thereupon held, and an immediate retreat determined on. During the conference, Lewis Wetzel sat upon a log, with his gun carelessly resting across his knees. The moment it was resolved to retreat, most of the party started in disordered haste, but the commander, observing Wetzel still sitting on the log, turned to inquire if he was not going along. "No," was his sullen reply. "I came out to hunt Indians, and now that they are found, I am not going home like a fool, with my fingers in my mouth. I am determined to take an Indian scalp or lose my own." All arguments were unavailing, and there they were compelled to leave him a lone man in a desolate wilderness, surrounded by an enemy vigilant, cruel, bloodthirsty, and of horrid barbarity, with no friend but his rifle, and no guide but the sure index which an all-wise Providence had deep set in the heavens above. Once by himself, and looking around to feel satisfied that they were all gone, he gathered his blanket about him, adjusted his tomahawk and scalping knife, shouldered his rifle, and moved off in an opposite direction, hoping that a small party of Indians might be met with. Keeping away from the larger streams, he strolled on cautiously, peering into every dell and suspicious covert, and keenly sensitive to the least sound of a suspicious character. Nothing, however, crossed his path that day. The night being dark and chilly, it was necessary to have a fire, but to show a light in the midst of his enemy would be to invite certain destruction. To avoid this, he constructed a small coal pit out of bark, dried leaves, etc., and covering these with loose earth, leaving an occasional air hole, he seated himself, encircling the pit with his legs, and then completed the hole by covering his head with a blanket. In this manner he would produce a temperature equal, as he expressed it, to that of a stove room. This was certainly an original and ingenious mode of getting up a fire, without at the same time endangering himself by a light. During most of the following day, he roamed through the forest without noticing any signs of Indians. At length smoke was discovered, and going in the direction of it found a camp, but tenantless. It contained 2 blankets and a small kettle, which Wetzel at once knew belonged to 2 Indians who were doubtless out hunting. Concealing himself in the matted undergrowth, he patiently awaited the return of the occupants. About sunset, one of the Indians came in and made up the fire, and went on to cooking his supper. Shortly after the other came in, they then ate their supper and began to sing and amuse themselves by telling comic stories, at which they would burst into roars of laughter. Singing and telling amusing stories was a common practice of both white and red men when lying in their hunting camps. These poor fellows, when enjoying themselves in the utmost glee, little dreamed that Louis Wetzel was so close. About 9 or 10 o'clock, one of the Indians wrapped his blanket around him, shouldered his rifle, took a chunk of fire in his hand, and left the camp, doubtless with the intention of going to watch a deer lick. The fire and smoke would serve to keep off the gnats and mosquitoes. It is a remarkable fact that deer are not alarmed at seeing fire, from the circumstance of meeting it so frequently in the fall and winter seasons, when the leaves and grass are dry and the woods on fire. The absence of the Indian was a cause of vexation and disappointment to Wetzel, whose trap was so heavily set that he considered his game secure. He still indulged the hope that the Indian would return to camp before day, but in this he was disappointed. There are birds in the woods which commence chirping at the break of day, and like the cock give notice to the woodman that the light will soon appear. Louis heard the wooded songsters begin to chatter, and determined to delay no longer the work of death, for the return of the other Indian. He walked to the camp with a noiseless step, and found his victim buried in profound sleep, lying upon one side. He drew his butcher knife and, with the utmost force, impelled by revenge, sent the blade through his heart. He said the Indian gave a short quiver, a convulsive motion, and then laid still in the sleep of death. Louis scalped him and set out for home. He arrived at the Mingo Bottom only one day after his unsuccessful companions. He claimed, and as he should, received his reward. A most fatal decoy on the frontier was the turkey call. On several different occasions, men from the fort at Wheeling had gone across the hill in quest of a turkey, whose plaintive cries had elicited their attention, and on more than one occasion the men never returned. Wetzel suspected the cause and determined to satisfy himself. On the east side of the creek hill, and at a point elevated 60 feet above the water, there is a capacious cavern, the entrance to which at that time was almost obscured by a heavy growth of vines and foliage. Into this the alluring Indian would crawl, and could there have an extensive view of the hill front on the opposite side. From that cavern issued the decoy of death to more than one incautious soldier and settler. Wetzel knew of the existence and exact locality of this cave, and accordingly started out before day, and by a circuitous route reached the spot from the rear. Posting himself so as to command a view of the opening, he waited patiently for the expected cry. Directly the twisted tuft of an Indian warrior slowly rose in the mouth of the cave, and looking cautiously about, sent forth a long, shrill, peculiar cry, and immediately sunk back out of view. Louis screened himself in his position, cocked his gun, and anxiously awaited for a reappearance of the head. In a few minutes up rose the tuft. Louis drew a fine aim at the polished head, and the next instant the brains of the Indian were scattered about the cave. That turkey troubled the inhabitants no longer, and tradition does not say whether the place was ever after similarly occupied. A singular custom with this daring borderer was to take a fall hunt into the Indian country. Equipping himself, he set out and penetrated to the Muskingum, and fell upon a camp of 4 Indians. Hesitating a moment whether to attack the party, so much his superior in numerical strength, he determined to make the attempt. At the hour of midnight, when naught was heard but the long dismal howl of the wolf, cruel as death and hungry as the grave, burning for blood, bony, gaunt, and grim, he moved cautiously from his covert, and gliding through the darkness stealthily approached the camp, supporting his rifle in one hand and a tomahawk in the other. A dim flicker from the campfire faintly revealed the forms of the sleepers, wrapped in that profound slumber which, to part of them, was to know no waking. There they lay with their dark faces turned up to the night sky, in the deep solitude of their own wilderness, little dreaming that their most relentless enemy was hovering over them. Quietly resting his gun against a tree, he unsheathed his knife, and with an intrepidity that could never be surpassed, he stepped boldly forward like the minister of death, and quick as thought cleft the skull of one of his sleeping victims. In an instant, a second one was similarly served, and as a third attempted to rise, confused by the horrid yells with which Wetzel accompanied his blows, he too shared the fate of his companions, and sunk dead at the feet of this ruthless slayer. The fourth darted into the darkness of the wood and escaped, although Wetzel pursued him some distance. Returning to camp, he scalped his victims and then left for home. When asked on his return what luck he had had, not much was his reply. I treed 4 Indians, but 1 got away. This unexampled achievement stamped him as one of the most daring and at the same time most successful hunters of his day. The distance to and from the scene of this adventure could not have been less than 170 miles. During one of his scouts in the neighborhood of Wheeling, Wetzel took shelter on a stormy evening in a deserted cabin on the bottom, not far from the present residence of Mr. Hamilton Woods. Gathering a few broken boards, he prepared a place in the loft to sleep. Scarcely had he got himself adjusted for a nap when 6 Indians entered, and striking a fire commenced preparing their homely meal. Wetzel watched their movements closely with drawn knife, determined the moment he was discovered to leap into their midst and in the confusion endeavor to escape. Fortunately they did not see him, and soon after the supper the whole 6 fell asleep. Wetzel now crawled noiselessly down and hid himself behind a log, at a convenient distance from the door of the cabin. At early dawn a tall Indian stepped from the door, and stretching up both hands in a long, hearty yawn, seemed to draw in new life from the pure, invigorating atmosphere. In an instant Wetzel had his finger on the trigger, and the next moment the Indian fell heavily to the ground, his life's blood gushing upon the young grass brilliant with the morning dewdrops. The report of his rifle had not ceased echoing through the valley ere the daring borderer was far away, secure from all pursuit. When about 25 years of age, Lewis entered the service of General Harmer, commanding at Marietta, Ohio. His new duties growing distasteful, he took a leave of absence and visited his friends in the neighborhood of Wheeling. Shortly afterwards, however, he returned to duty and was chiefly employed in the capacity of scout. It was whilst thus engaged that an affair occurred which changed the whole current of his life. Of the Indians who visited Marietta was one of some celebrity, known by the name of George Washington. He was a large, fine-looking Indian and of much influence in his tribe. The time we write of was one of comparative peace, and General Harmer was particularly anxious to preserve the good feeling then subsisting. Wetzel, during one of his scouts, met this Indian and shot him. The act was justly regarded as an outrage, and he was accordingly arrested and placed in close confinement at the fort. Wetzel admitted without hesitation that he had shot the Indian. As he did not wish to be hung like a dog, he requested the general to give him up to the Indians, as there were a large number of them present. He might place them all in a circle with their scalping knives and tomahawks, and then give him a tomahawk and place him in the midst of the circle, and then let him and the Indians fight it out in the best way they could. The general told him that he was an officer appointed by the law, by which he must be governed. As the law did not authorize him to make such a compromise, he could not grant his request. After a few days' longer confinement, he again sent for the general to come and see him, and he did so. Wetzel said he had never been confined and could not live much longer if he was not permitted some room to walk about. The general ordered the officer on guard to knock off his iron fetters, but to leave on his handcuffs and permit him to walk about on the point at the mouth of the Muskingum, but to be sure to keep a close watch upon him. As soon as they were outside of the fort gate, Lewis began to caper about like a wild colt, broken loose from the stall. He would start and run a few yards as if he were about to make an escape, and then turn round and join the guard. The next start he would run further and then stop. In this way he amused the guard for some time, at every start running a little further. At length he called forth all his strength, resolution, and activity, and determined on freedom or an early death. He gave a sudden spring forward and bounded off at the top of his speed, for the shelter of his beloved woods. His movement was so quick and so unexpected that the guards were taken by surprise, and he got nearly 100 yards before they recovered from their astonishment. They fired, but all missed. They followed in pursuit, but he soon left them out of sight. As he was well acquainted with the country, he made for a dense thicket, about 2 or 3 miles from the fort. In the midst of this thicket he found a tree which had fallen across a log, where the brush were very close. Under this tree he squeezed his body. The brush was so thick that he could not be discovered unless his pursuers examined very closely. As soon as his escape was announced, General Harmar started the soldiers and Indians in pursuit. After he had lain about 2 hours in his place of concealment, 2 Indians came into the thicket, and stood on the very same log under which he lay concealed. His heart beat so violently, he was afraid they would hear it thumping. He could hear them howling in every direction as they hunted through the brush. At length, as the day wore away, Lewis found himself alone in the friendly thicket. But what should he do? His hands were fastened with iron cuffs and bolts, and he knew of no friend on the same side of the Ohio to whom he could apply for assistance. He had a friend who had recently put up a cabin on the Virginia side of the Ohio, who he had no doubt would lend him any assistance in his power. With the most gloomy foreboding of the future, a little after nightfall he left the thicket and made his way to the Ohio. He came to the river about 3 or 4 miles below the fort. He took this circuit as he expected guards would be at every point where he could find a canoe. How to get across the river was the all-important question. He could not make a raft with his hands bound. He was an excellent swimmer, but was fearful he could not swim the Ohio with his heavy iron handcuffs. After pausing some time, he determined to make the attempt. Nothing worse than death could happen, and he would prefer drowning than again falling into the hands of Harmar and his Indians. Like the illustrious Caesar in the storm, he would trust the event to fortune, and he plunged into the river. He swam the greater part of the distance on his back, and reached the Virginia shore in safety, but so exhausted that he had to lay on the beach some time before he was able to rise. He went to the cabin of his friend, where he was received with rapture. A file and hammer soon released him from his iron handcuffs. Information having reached General Harmar of Wetzel's whereabouts, he sent a party of men in a canoe to take him. As the boat neared the Virginia shore, Wetzel and his friend and several other men posted themselves on the bank and threatened to shoot the first man who landed. Unwilling to venture further, the party returned, and Lewis made his way homeward, having been furnished by his kind friend with gun, ammunition, tomahawk, blanket, and other provisions. Exasperated at the escape of Wetzel, General Harmar offered a large reward for his apprehension, and at the same time dispatched a file of men to the neighborhood of Wheeling, with orders to take him dead or alive. The detachment was under the command of a Captain Kingsbury, who, hearing that Wetzel was to be at Mingo Bottom on a certain day, marched thither to execute his orders. We will let an eyewitness finish the story. A company of men could as easily have drawn old Horny out of the bottomless pit as to take Lewis Wetzel by force from the neighborhood of Mingo Bottom. On the day that Captain Kingsbury arrived, there was a shooting match at my father's, and Lewis Wetzel was there. As soon as the object of Captain Kingsbury was ascertained, it was resolved to ambush the captain's barge and kill him and his company. Happily, Major McMahon was present to prevent this catastrophe, and prevailed on Wetzel and his friends to suspend the attack till he would pay Captain Kingsbury a visit, and perhaps he would prevail him to return without making an attempt to take Wetzel. With a great deal of reluctance, they agreed to suspend the attack till Major McMahon should return. The resentment and fury of Wetzel and his friends were boiling and blowing, like the steam from a skate pipe of a steamboat. A pretty affair this, said they, to hang a man for killing an Indian, when they are killing some of our people almost every day. Major McMahon informed Captain Kingsbury of the force and fury of the people, and assured him that if he persisted in the attempt to seize Wetzel, he would have all the settlers in the country upon him, that nothing could save him and his company from a massacre but a speedy return. The captain took his advice and forthwith returned to Fort Harmar. Wetzel considered the affair now as finally adjusted. In this, however, he was mistaken. His roving disposition never permitted him to remain long in one place. Soon after the transactions just recorded, he descended the river to Limestone or Maysville. And while there, engaged in his harmless frolicking, an avaricious fellow named Lawler, a lieutenant in the army, going down the river with a company of soldiers for Fort Washington, landed at Maysville and found Wetzel sitting in a tavern. Lawler returned to his boat and procured some soldiers, seized Wetzel and dragged him aboard the boats, and without a moment's delay pushed off, and that night delivered him to General Harmer at Fort Washington, where he again had to undergo the ignominy of having his hands and feet bound with irons. The noise of Wetzel's capture, and captured too for only killing an Indian, spread through the country like wildfire. The passions of the frontiersmen were roused up to the highest pitch of fury. Petitions for his release were sent from the most influential men to the general, from every quarter where the story had been heard. The general at first paid but little attention to these. At length, however, the settlements along the Ohio and some of the back counties were preparing to embody in military array to release him by force of arms. General Harmar, seeing the storm that was approaching, had Wetzel's irons knocked off and set him at liberty. Wetzel was once more a free man. He returned to his friends and was caressed by young and old with undiminished respect. The vast number of scalps which he had taken proved his invincible courage, as well as his prowess in war. The sufferings and persecutions by which he had been pursued by General Harmer secured for him the sympathy of the frontiersmen. The higher he was esteemed, the lower sank the character of General Harmar with the fiery spirits on the frontier. Had Harmar possessed a tithe of the courage, skill, and indomitable energy of Wetzel, the gallant soldiers under his command, in the memorable and disastrous campaign against the Miamis, might have shared a very different fate. Shortly after his return from Kentucky, a relative from Dunkard Creek invited Lewis home with him. The invitation was accepted, and the two leisurely wended their way along, hunting and sporting as they traveled. On reaching the home of the young man, what should they see instead of the hospitable roof but a pile of smoking ruins? Wetzel instantly examined the trail and found that the Marauders were 3 Indians and 1 white man, and that they had taken 1 prisoner. That captive proved to be the betrothed of the young man, whom nothing could restrain from pushing on in immediate pursuit. Placing himself under the direction of Wetzel, the two strode on, hoping to overhaul the enemy before they had crossed the Ohio. It was found after proceeding a short distance that the Indians had taken great care to obliterate their trail, but the keen discernment of Wetzel once on the track, and there need not be much difficulty. He knew that they would make for the river by the most expeditious routes, and therefore disregarding their trail he pushed on, so as to head them off at the crossing place. After an hour's hard travel they struck a path which the deer had made, and which their sagacity had taught them to carry over knolls in order to avoid the great curves of ravines. Wetzel followed the path because he knew that it was almost a direct line to the point at which he was aiming. Night coming on, the tireless and determined hunters partook of a hurried meal, then again pushed forward, guided by the lamps hung in the heavens above them, until towards midnight a heavy cloud shut out their light and obscured the path. Early on the following morning they resumed the chase and descended from the elevated ridge, along which they had been passing for an hour or two, found themselves in a deep and quiet valley which looked as though human steps had never before pressed its virgin soil. Traveling a short distance they discovered fresh footsteps in the soft sands, and upon close examination, the eye of Wetzel's companion detected the impress of a small shoe, with nail heads around the heel, which he at once recognized as belonging to his fiancée. Hour after hour the pursuit was kept up, now tracing the trail across hills, over alluvion, and often detecting it where the wily captors had taken to the beds of streams. Late in the afternoon they found themselves approaching the Ohio River, and shortly after dark discovered as they struck the river the camp of the enemy on the opposite side, and just below the mouth of Captina. Swimming the river, the two reconnoitered the position of the camp, and discovered the locality of the captive. Wetzel proposed waiting until daylight before making the attack, but the almost frantic lover was for immediate action. Wetzel, however, would listen to no suggestion, and thus they awaited the break of day. At early dawn the Indians were up and preparing to leave, when Wetzel directed his companion to take good aim at the white renegade, while he would make sure work of one of the Indians. They fired at the same moment and with fatal effect. Instantly the young man rushed forward to release the captive, and Wetzel, reloading, pursued the two Indians who had taken to the woods, to ascertain the strength of the attacking party. Wetzel pursued a short distance and then fired his rifle at random to draw the Indians from their retreat. The trick succeeded, and they made after him with uplifted tomahawks, yelling at the height of their voices. The adroit hunter soon had his rifle loaded, and wheeling suddenly discharged its contents through the body of his nearest pursuer. The other Indian now rushed impetuously forward, thinking to dispatch his enemy in a moment. Wetzel, however, kept dodging from tree to tree, and being more fleet than the Indian, managed to keep ahead until his unerring gun was again loaded, when turning he fired, and the last of the party lay dead before him. Soon after the occurrence just narrated, Wetzel determined to visit the extreme south, and for that purpose engaged on a flatboat about leaving New Orleans. Many months elapsed before his friends heard anything of his whereabouts, and then it was to learn that he was in close confinement at New Orleans, under some weighty charge. What the exact nature of this charge was has never been fully ascertained, but it is very certain that he was imprisoned and treated like a felon for nearly 2 years. The charge is supposed to have been of some trivial character, and has been justly regarded as a great outrage. It was alleged at the time of his arrest to have been for uttering counterfeit coin, but this being disproved, it was then charged that he had been guilty of illicit connection with the wife of a Spaniard. Of the nature of these charges, however, we know but little, and it may therefore be unsafe to say more. He was finally released by the intervention of our government, and reached home by the way of Philadelphia, to which city he had been sent from New Orleans. Mr. Rotiver says that he saw him immediately after his return, and that his personal appearance had undergone great change from his long confinement. He remained but 2 days on Wheeling Creek after his return, one at his mother's and the other at Captain Bonnet's, the father of Mrs. Rotifer. Many of the older citizens have told us that they saw him during this brief visit, and conversed freely with him about the infamous manner in which he had been treated. From the settlement he went to Wheeling, where he remained a few days, and then left again for the south, vowing vengeance against the person whom he believed to have been accessory to his imprisonment, and in degrading his person with the vile rust of a felon's chain. During his visit to Wheeling he remained with George Cookus, a relative. Our informant says that she met him there and heard Mrs. Cookus plague him about getting married, and jocularly asked whether he ever intended to take a wife. "No," he replied, "there is no woman in this world for me, but I expect there is one in heaven." After an absence of many months, he again returned to the neighborhood of Wheeling, but whether he avenged his real or imaginary wrongs upon the person of the Spaniard alluded to, the biographer at this time has not the means of saying. His propensity to roam the woods was still as great as ever, and soon after his return an incident occurred which showed that he had lost none of his cunning while undergoing incarceration at New Orleans. Returning home from a hunt north of the Ohio River, somewhat fatigued and a little careless of his movements, he suddenly espied an Indian in the very act of raising his gun to fire. Both immediately sprung to trees, and there they stood for an hour, each afraid of the other. What was to be done? To remain there during the whole day, for it was then early in the morning, was out of the question. Now it was that the sagacity of Wetzel displayed itself. Cautiously adjusting his bearskin cap to the end of his ramrod, with the slightest, most dubious and hesitating motion, as though afraid to venture a glance, the cap protruded. In an instant a crack was heard, and off was torn the fatal cap of the sure ball of the ever-vigilant Indian. Leaping from his retreat, Wetzel rapidly advanced upon the astonished Indian, and ere the tomahawk could be brought to its work of death, the tawny foe sprang convulsively into the air, and straightening as he descended, fell upon his face, quite dead. Wetzel was universally regarded as one of the most efficient scouts and practiced woodsmen of the day. He was frequently engaged by parties who desired to hunt up and locate lands, but were afraid of the Indians. Under the protection of Louis Wetzel, however, they felt safe, and thus he was often engaged for months at a time. Of those who became largely interested in Western lands was John Madison, brother of James, afterwards President Madison. He employed Louis Wetzel to go with him through the Kanawha region. During their expedition they came upon a deserted hunter's camp, in which were concealed some goods. Each of them helped himself to a blanket, and that day in crossing Little Kanawha, they were fired upon by a concealed party of Indians, and Madison was killed. General Clark, the companion of Lewis in the celebrated tour across the Rocky Mountains, had heard much of Lewis Wetzel in Kentucky and determined to secure his services in the perilous enterprise. A messenger was accordingly sent for him, but he was reluctant to go. However, he finally consented and accompanied the party during the first 3 months of travel, but then declined going any further and returned home. Shortly after this, he left again on a flatboat and never returned. He visited a relative named Philip Sykes living about 20 miles in the interior from Natchez, and there made his home until the summer of 1808, when he died. The personal appearance of this distinguished borderer is very remarkable. His complexion was very dark, and eyes of the most intense blackness, wild, rolling, and piercing as the dagger's point, emitting, when excited, such fierce and withering glances as to cause the stoutest adversary to quail beneath their power. His hair was of raven jetness and very luxuriant, reaching when combed out below his knees. This would have been a rare scalp for the Indians, and one for which they would at any time have given a dozen of their best warriors. When Lewis Wetzel professed friendship, he was true as the needle to the pole. He loved his friends and hated their enemies. He was a rude, blunt man of few words before company, but with his friends not only sociable, but an agreeable companion. Such was Lewis Wetzel. His name and fame will long survive when the achievements of men vastly his superior in rank and intellect will slumber with the forgotten past. So that's it for this episode. Lewis Wetzel was quite an interesting and controversial character. The book didn't mention it, but Wetzel's nickname among the Indians was Deathwind. Wikipedia claims that Wetzel was a quarter Mohawk, but I have been unable to find another source that supports this claim. Wetzel's father was born in Holland, and he spent some time as an indentured servant to pay off his debt for the trip to America. Wetzel's mother was descended from French Huguenots who also arrived shortly before Lewis was born, so it's unclear which of his grandparents could have been a Mohawk Indian. The book also did not provide much information about Wetzel's death. This article, published in 2008 by the Washington Times, provides a little more information. The official version of Wetzel's death is that he died in 1808 from fever while living at a relative's home near Natchez, Mississippi. In fact, in 1942, Dr. Albert Bowser, a Wetzel researcher, exhumed a skeleton purported to be that of the Indian fighter from a grave on the property. Today, these remains rest in a cemetery in Moundsville, West Virginia. Nevertheless, author Alan Eckert, who studied the life of Wetzel while writing the book, That Dark and Bloody River, claims that Wetzel moved west, eventually settling along the Brazos River in Texas. According to Eckert, he died there in 1839. So there's evidence that he died near Natchez in 1808 at the home of his cousin Philip Sykes, but some stories suggest that he moved west and eventually settled along the Brazos River with a Spanish wife. The latter story could make sense if the Spanish wife he took was married and they wanted to get away from her husband. This could have also been the source of some of his troubles in New Orleans. Feel free to share any information or theories you have about Wetzel and his life in the comments. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is no longer deemed worthy of being shown on history channels on TV. Those channels have abandoned their mission and no longer play much actual history anymore. This happens to be the 200th episode of Unworthy History. Thanks for watching these episodes about the lives of people who lived long before us, without the luxuries we enjoy today. People whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.